Welcome to Integrated Wellbeing YouTube channel and podcast for people in grief and the professionals who serve them. We provide education, inspiration, and practical tools by interviewing those bereaved by loss, mental health professionals, and grief specialists. Integrated Wellbeing Institute seeks to awaken the griever to their inner peace through the guidance of the body. And today I am so delighted to introduce to you Robert Zucker. Hello, Robert. Thank you so much for being our guest today.
Hi, Georgina. It's really nice to be here.
Thank you. I'm only going to share a snippet of Robert's amazing bio, and the rest of it will be posted in the show notes below. But his biography begins, Robert Zucker, MACTFT, is a grief counselor, trainer, consultant, and author. So Robert, as we do with so many of our guests, we begin with, how did you end up in the field of grief? What were your major losses?
Well, I started out being introduced, at least aware of grief, quite at an early age. I was 4 years old when my grandmother moved into our house after her husband died, my grandfather, and so she moved in with us at around the same time that my mom was pregnant with her fourth child. I was the third of four children, and my brothers and I were the first three, and we all were a year apart. So my mom had 3 kids in a row, and then 5 years later my sister Diane was born. So anyway, so as we were kind of preparing for this new child, my I don't remember my grandfather's death, but it was around that time, and then my grandmother Bertha, my father's mother, moved in with us, and I got to I was always interested, of course, in who she was. I've visited her, but I didn't really know that well, and I was pretty young. But she was someone that I watched a lot, and what I saw was someone who would sit at the top of the stairs, often for most of the day, and she would wring her hands, and she would be very pensive and worried, often for a good portion of the day, particularly probably in the later part of the day, worrying about my dad, hoping he'll come home and be safe and won't be in an accident, come home from work, and there was a kind of distance that she maintained. She had a small bedroom with a kitchenette in it where she stayed on the second floor of her house. So she didn't eat with us typically, and was very frugal. I used to go shopping with her. We walked to the A&P for years, and I just saw how incredibly careful she was about her money. She had a little change purse, and she'd open it up, and she'd count out what she can get, and she'd always buy things that were moldy or kind of old, and fruit that didn't look good, veggies that didn't look good, and she'd buy discounted items, and very, very careful. And then she cooked things for herself up in her bedroom, and even on holidays, she like we're Jewish, so we have Passover, a major big event in Jewish families. She would come downstairs, but she wouldn't sit at the table. She didn't want to wear out the furniture. She would hold her plate, and she would eat standing up, to the consternation of my mother. This is her mother-in-law, who was just behaving in ways that were just very uncomfortable for her. In her home, she wanted her to be comfortable, but she couldn't do that. And it always was strange. I wondered what was going on. Or just in some ways, it was normal. So I'm not sure I wondered until I was a little older, and I started like comparing my family with other families. But she would sit on this in the evening after my father got home. She would come halfway down the steps, and then she'd lean over the banister when we were watching TV because she didn't want to sit on the furniture in the den where the TV was. So she was always self-effacing, always minimizing herself, not really seeming like she could invest in or take the risk of really living comfortably in her son's home. Anyway, so I'm getting to the point. I kind of painted the picture for you. But my grandmother was every year would go to the cemetery to my grandfather's grave. But my father wasn't the person in the family who took her. His older brother, my Uncle Joe, would always come with his family, pick her up, and take her to the cemetery. So when I was around 11, I said, "Can I go?" So they said, "Sure." So I piled in the car, and we drove with my grandmother and with my cousins and my aunt and uncle, and we drove to the cemetery, which was probably an hour away, long ride.
Wow.
And then we got to the cemetery, and they had a trunk filled up with shovels and plants, and they had a routine that I saw. They go to the gravesite and they'd plant and really maintain the grave with great attention. Everyone had a job to do, but I kind of like watched what they were doing. And but my grandmother, I saw, got out of the car with everybody, and she just walked by her husband's grave, and she walked a little ways away, and I was watching her off a little ways from the cemetery plot, and she fell down on top of a small stone and was weeping, just a powerful crying at the stone. And the feeling I had was, you're not supposed to look or something, because I saw that everybody was ignoring her. There was no attention paid to her whatsoever. So I walked over and I looked, and I saw the name on the stone, and I realized it was a child. She had a child, and one of my father's siblings. My father, I thought, is two siblings. I had one sibling, his brother Joe, but this was Pauline, who had died. And I'm watching that with curiosity and interest. What is this? What is this? It didn't make sense how this was playing out. And then they were done after some time. They finished the gardening, whatever they did there, and started loading up the trunk and piling into the car. But my grandmother was still at the gravestone. She was just laying on the stone. It was just amazing that this was happening to me. For me, it was amazing to see what was happening. I was in the back seat of the car, kind of crowded in. I could see out the window my grandmother, and I saw my Uncle Joe walk over to her and just pick her up, and she was limp. Carried her to the car, opened the door where I was sitting, and shoved her in the car next to me. And everybody drove back to my house. Like I said, it was a relatively long ride home. And we got to the house, and they just dropped us off. So I came into the house, and really what I wanted to do was see my dad. I wanted to, because this is his sister. And I wanted to find him, and he was home, and I said, "Dad, I didn't know you had a sister." And he said, "We don't talk about it." End of conversation, and never did he talk about it, ever. So I had this little piece of information that was always unsettling for me and kind of shoved away from me. After my grandmother died quite a few years later, and my father died young. He just died 6 months after my grandmother. He died at age 53. So, but I remember going to my grandmother's. Well, I'll skip that. Let's skip that story because it's getting a little bit in the weeds. But I learned a lot about my grandmother and her personal life at the cemetery because her sister told me all sorts of stories about her sister, and my grandma. And but anyway, a few years later, my Uncle Joe was still alive, and I thought that he was a resource for me to get in touch with what was happening, what was going on, and who was Pauline, and I wanted to kind of fill in the gaps. After my grandmother died, I did find a picture of who I presumed was Pauline. She was in a drawer in her dresser, never hung on the wall. She was in there. My uncle told me that she died in the polio epidemic in New York City. He said that my grandmother was so bereft that she didn't allow anyone to play music in the house thereafter. There was no laughter at home. She was she was deeply depressed. And my grandfather told his sons never to talk about their sister. And my father kept that pledge. He never talked about her. So that's my first introduction to grief. And my dad's death was intertwined in that story as well.
Mm-hmm.
Many years later, I was very much drawn to working with bereaved parents, but I didn't know why. So I was really interested. There was a job opportunity at a major hospital, medical center near where I lived, and I saw that it was to develop and direct a pediatric bereavement counseling program, working with families and children. And at that point, I was doing therapy and I was working with children a lot and families, but I'd never even read Kubler-Ross. I was not tuned in, to the grief world at all. But I went for this job, and I got the job, and they basically hired me to develop a program and to really. They knew that I wasn't well versed in grief, but something about me they saw, and particularly with my work with children and families, and they said, we want to give you about 6 months to research before you see any families, just to really find out what's happening in hospitals around the country. You can travel anywhere you need to go, and develop a program. So that's the opportunity that was handed me. About a few years into my work, I had written a paper. I had been working with a group of bereaved parents, and it was a writing workshop I was doing with them. They were doing a lot of writing about their loss in a very intimate setting. And then they became interested, this group, and that was an ongoing group, became interested in reading their writing in a public setting. So we started developing these public events, conferences that would include them in and that sort of thing. So the paper that I wrote was Bereaved Parents Going Public, and the stepping out with their stories, and how that was really important for many bereaved parents. It seemed like within this group, it's very meaningful to speak their stories aloud. And I was reading the paper at Columbia University at a conference. I was coming up to read the paper, but I was sitting. It was my first paper I ever presented anywhere, and I was sitting there nervous, and I thought, Grandma, it's hard to imagine that I never put this together. That my whole passion for bereaved parents who didn't have voices to speak their voices, my grandmother's voice was stifled. And to the point where I didn't even make the connection because there was some kind of compelling issue for me not to speak about my grandmother. So I was very moved in my seat waiting to speak. And when I came up to speak, I couldn't read the paper. I was just told about my grandmother. I had to talk about my grandmother.
Wow. I'm so glad you did, because I'm imagining that was the ripple effect in the room that really made a difference for everyone.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that has a lot to do with what I'm doing. It wasn't where I thought I was going at all. But once I got some clarity, which took some time, I landed into it.
Yes. And one thing led to another, and it unfolded as this miraculous career and all these contributions that you've made. Mm-hmm. So it's very interesting to hear you say bereaved parents go public, because what I'm doing is facilitating a closed grief group of mothers whose children have died by suicide. And it was so neat in yesterday's group. My experience of it was seeing us go deeper. I had made the invitation the week before. What is it that is really bothering you out in the world that you'd like to bring here for us to discuss? And we did that. And then this week we went even deeper, Robert. So I so appreciate your recognition decades ago of how important it is for them to go public and tell this story. Yeah. You know? Wow. So how long did you stay at the hospital in that position?
About 9 years. And from there, well, while I was there, it was such a wonderful opportunity. And I started doing a lot of speaking engagements that were, within schools and colleges, around, also within the hospital, to different departments. And I really loved speaking. I loved, just presenting my work and just having that kind of energy. So with that interest, it kind of led me to, basically it led me to doing workshops. So I maintained a private practice at that point, and started, I got involved with an organization that was basically promoting therapists to give workshops to a large extent on grief. It was called CMI.
Oh, good.
Yeah. So I was a grief presenter to social workers, psychologists, nurses, clergy, that audience, and talking about complicated grief and issues. I did workshops on bereaved parents. It was interesting because I'm not a bereaved parent, but I grew up in a bereaved parent impacted home.
You certainly did.
Yeah.
And that impacted is the perfect word. It wasn't influence, it was impact.
It was because it was a very personal experience. And when I gave my talks, I would begin the talk telling the story of my grandmother, which I haven't shared in quite a while. It's nice to do it here. But I wanted to introduce her to the group because she was my teacher. About the taboos and about the fear. I think they were very afraid that she would hurt herself or kill herself. It was never spoken, but this the need to just not share it, and she was hiding out with it. She was. She didn't. I know. I only can imagine what it was like for her, to have that prohibition of her entire life. And even when she would go to the cemetery to have that experience where she was just alone there, and the isolation.
Yes.
Experiences. So yeah, I started eventually working part-time in hospices, sometimes full-time. Always for about 25 years, I was doing primarily workshops and private practice with some consulting. And so, my career went through different kinds of phases.
Certainly.
A number of years. It's over 40 years now.
Oh, that's amazing. And it's always evolving. And isn't it interesting how you don't have to seek the next opportunity? It finds you.
It does, surprising me all the time. I started working with, I was contacted by a lawyer who was working with a family that was dealing with the death of a child through a fault of the company. It was a wrongful death case. It was a mistake that the company had made with a product that resulted in the death of the child. And so out of the blue, this lawyer in Las Vegas contacted me, and he had found me online. This is probably 20 years ago.
Wow, that was just the beginning of online.
Yeah, and he said, "Yeah, that's right. I think it was about 20. Yeah." So he said he's in a bind. He really wants some help understanding bereaved parents. And he said, "Would you be able to work with me on the case? I'd like you to fly out. Like the case was coming up soon, and he wasn't prepared. Could you fly out next week to Nevada and meet this woman and help me understand her?" So I said, "Sure." And so I called my brother, who's a lawyer, and I said, "Help! What do I need to know here? How much do I charge?" Like I had no idea what expert witnesses get paid, and so I figured it all out with my brother's help, and I started doing this expert witness gig, which led to others, and over the course of
interesting.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that was
what was your big takeaway? What was your big takeaway? I'm curious, as in the expert witness gig.
Well, the personally takeaway for me was that I don't want to testify in court. It was very scary for me. So I realized that I don't want to be an expert witness. I want to be an expert consultant, which is what I've been in all my cases. I want to be able to do exactly what that guy hired me to do. Help me understand, this in her perspective. What is her grief like? So
yes.
So since then, that's what I've been doing. It's really it's what I can do best. I recently took on a case that could have led to a trial, but it was such an exciting case that I took it on, and I was so relieved when I didn't go to trial. So things settle out of court very often, and that was really much preferred by me. So that's one takeaway.
Wow. That's amazing. That's amazing. So what I'm hearing is that with the bereaved parents, you learned how important it is for them to have a voice. And in a way that gave a restoration to your grandmother's experience. Because as you were telling me about her, I felt her lack and limitation and pulling in, which is grief, and the worry, doubt, fear. I heard all of that. And then as you were working with people as speakers, that was a whole nother learning. And I'm curious, how many papers have you written?
I don't know. I'm not sure. It's been quite a few over the years. I mean, I'm not a prolific paper, and I'm not an academic, but I do like to write about, write about my experiences and kind of draw what conclusions I've drawn. From the work, what lessons learned. So yeah, but academic writing kind of is uncomfortable for me, so I haven't done, I've been offered.
It is. It's really hard work.
Yeah.
Yes. I wrote a memoir. That was hard enough. I don't want to do an academic paper, Yeah. Thank heavens my master's track let me avoid that. I was very happy.
Mine too. Yeah.
It was really great.
But research is interesting, but it's not my thing. Yeah.
I know. I'm with you right there on that. So it's very interesting how the consulting came to be. And how you were protected in many ways. I don't want to be an expert witness, but I can be an expert consultant behind the scenes and help them build their case.
Yeah. And then in the course of that, you get to really meet people and, all sorts of losses. Often they're traumatic losses, violent losses.
Oh, yes.
So, and you really, it's always been a privilege to work with people who are deeply in the midst of that raw kind of suffering. And part of me is drawn to that, and, wanting to sit with people and be present when they're needing to help me understand what's going on, which is the nature of what I kind of do. work.
And your presence then, I'm imagining, I've had so many comments about this, brings that stability to them.
Mm-hmm.
It allows them to know I'm not alone. And that's what's so important. And that's who you are, is that presence for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. And that yeah, that's kind of a general, it sounds like we're similar in terms of the work that we do in that regard. Is that presence that is stabilizing, kind of grounding,
Mm-hmm.
we offer people. When it's an expert case, there's this other component where they have a drive to kind of for justice, and they want me to understand so that they can help. The lawyers will be helped in the case that they're engaged in. So it's an interesting, different twist to it. Which
yes,
I find
many different twists to it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I heard you say it's been 40 years. I have failed retirement twice, and so I'm with you. So what is it that, as you look back on your career and look forward, what are the learnings that you can share with our audience, particularly those professionals who support people grieving? We've already talked about presence. So important for people to be present, because that automatically brings in that stability and that sense of, as Alan Wolfelt says, companioning. You're not alone.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I'd say a big learning for me and understanding in terms of how I work is the importance of my vulnerability.
Tell me more.
I kind of beginner's mind and vulnerability. I put those together. When I was hired at the hospital job back early in my career, I had been beginner's mind because I was a beginner, and I was learning all about grief for my clients. I was catching up on books I hadn't read, but I was also trying to kind of become more able to and facing difficulties of sitting with profound pain, because it was all parental grief, or sibling grief, or grandparent grief, and it was the focus of my career at that point. Particularly, it was 9 years I was based at the hospital. So I was a beginner's mind, learning, and also honestly not sure if I could do it, and I would ask my clients, how am I doing? Because I'm learning about grief from you. So I've had my own grief, but I'm learning about. I don't know whether I have to be a bereaved parent to work with bereaved parents. I remember saying that to people and saying, I'm not. And I'd say, I just need you to tell me. I'm here, to learn, and I'm also here to get feedback.
Yes.
And what I kept hearing was, you're doing it. You keep on doing it. So I was learning to be more confident, but I was very vulnerable. And that was I think that vulnerability kind of stays with me. But I was particularly faced with my vulnerability 7 years ago when my wife died. It was 8.5 years ago when she was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And it was in the throes of my career was really, I was busy, I was traveling, and I was working in a hospice that my wife and I both had worked at, and she just had become a hospice chaplain, and it was all this good stuff happening, in a lot of ways between us, and we had recently moved, and then she was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and it was a horrendous year and a half that resulted in her death. And I had stopped working as a caregiver, and I was just kind of stripped to the bone. I was just experiencing things that that my clients had experienced my whole career, and I kept thinking about my clients, and all the things they taught me that I was experiencing. It was such I don't know how to describe it. It was very painful, but it was also, I felt that they were with me in some ways. I literally, words people said to me would kind of help me. And so anyway, so when she finally died and I started picking up the pieces and getting back to my work, I realized that I was so vulnerable. But I also realized that I want to remain vulnerable, and I want to be someone who can cry with clients and be real and not have to. I want to kind of figure out boundaries a different way.
Yes.
Because I want to kind of, I respect boundaries. It's very important, but I want to figure out ways that I can still be true and am able to be vulnerable and emotional at times. Even, I remember when my wife was near dying, very, not as actively dying, but close to dying. I was close to the director of the hospice where she was, because I had worked there, and I was like family there. And there was a meeting that was held. She called me. It was a hospice house where my wife.
Oh yes, those are wonderful.
Yeah, it was. So she called me out into the garden, and she said, I need to talk with you. And she was telling me that my wife was very much into surviving, even to the very end. She was not able to let go and to really.
Oh wow.
So I was always in a situation where I knew she was dying, but I also was requiring that nobody talk to her about dying, because that's what my wife wanted. And I told Maria, the director of the hospice, when we signed on to hospice for my wife, that I'm of two minds. I know she's dying, but I also know she might not die. And that's what I carried. It's very hard to carry that. And she said,
it is.
It's very hard to do what you're trying to do, but we'll support you. And she did. And they carried this process through. But Maria called me out to the garden, and she had a meeting with the hospice medical director, who spoke to one of my wife's, with her doctor from Dana-Farber, who my wife loved. Anyway, they all agreed that my wife didn't have long to live, and she needed to go off the feeding tube that she was on. And but Maria knew how hard I was working at trying to be of two minds, and so she sat down and she just burst out crying, and it was hard for her to get the words out for a long time, and she just had to just say that she's dying. And this was not quote unquote professional,
I know.
but it was
family and true.
It was family. Yeah. It was an honor to know how much she cared about me.
Yes. And your wife.
And my wife, and she was there to help me through this, but she also was touched by it. That she had. And
yes.
For me, that worked. It was a great gift. I'm not. I don't do that. I don't burst out weeping with my clients, but that's not who I am. And I'm sure she doesn't do that I know she doesn't do it all the time.
No.
But she was able to with me in a way that she wouldn't be able to do with others. But I saw what a gift vulnerability can be. And when I went back to work, I wanted to figure out my way of being open-hearted and broken to an extent, even though I'm able to do what I'm doing. That's what
and that's what comes through when we had our pre-meeting to see if this would be a fit for our audience. Your authenticity simply just is right there, and your light is right there, and that's what our clients need. And they also, in my experience, benefit from our willingness to see them as our teachers. I have said over and over again, I continue to do this work because I learn from you.
Yes.
And it's a body-based approach that I have implemented for 25 years because it's what healed me through my grief after my son died by suicide. And now we've taken it so that licensed professionals can then add the somatics, because you and I both know we can't think our way through grief because it lives in the body. And so for you to be in that place of open-heartedness, that's the most, in my experience, our clients want. They desire that.
Mm-hmm.
And so you are doing that. And again, it brings them back to that stability.
Yes, yes. I want to share something else. That I remarried, and after my first wife's death, we married about 4 years later, but I met her about 2 years after my wife died.
Oh,
and so one of the things that I'm learning about is blended families, and learning about as an older person, learning about a new relationship as and what that means, and I never would have understood a lot of the pieces of what I'm experiencing, without being in it, but it's part of the learning curve that I'm experiencing, really understanding the complicated nature of grief in a changing family. I mean, I'm so much in the midst of it that I'm not able to really, be very clear about what I'm learning yet. But I'm really much part of it right now, and I guess I always will be. But I think at some point I could, yeah. At some point, hopefully, I could be more, eloquent about it. But it's a fascinating and sometimes very difficult time of my life, and a life that's filled with love and complication.
Mm-hmm. And to articulate that is difficult, because what I hear and experience at those times in my life is there's a mystical quality. There aren't words. We have to speak in metaphor. And so that's why it makes it so difficult to put into words. And it's, and it's so wonderful to hear that it was 2 years and then you met this woman. Yeah. And was there a part of you that knew right away, or was it we could be friends? What happened? I'm curious. We've never touched on this with our audience, and it happens to people.
Yeah, I know neither of us were at a point in our life where because both of us had lost partners.
Okay.
Both my wife. So we both, were, and the timing. He was, her partner was, he had died a year before my wife, so she was, on a similar journey further down the road. And it was a New Year's Day, and we met at a gathering of friends. We both went, we hadn't met before, but we both knew the host. It was an annual event.
Yes.
And I used to go with my wife too, and my first wife. So anyway, we met, and a friend of mine was there, and he had a feeling this was good, that he wanted us to meet, whatever that meant for him. So and he put us together, and he left us. So we both, I felt, was a very mystical, very spiritual, guided encounter. We just met, but also just felt that we'd known each other.
Yes.
Kind of feel. And so we were first kind of cautious, and we always talk about a conversation we had about a month into it. Well, we're going to take it slow, and and all that, but we didn't take it slow. She moved in within about 2 months, and our lives have been intertwined since. So with being together.
Yes.
So it was the amazing honeymoon phase is just like nothing else, but to have it later in life,
Yes,
is a wonderful
it
thing.
is. When you're mature and you can kind of grasp what's going on.
Yeah, hopefully. It was wonderful. It still is. Now it's more now it's dealing with more nitty gritty
Yes.
challenges,
Mm-hmm.
related to particularly my kids. My kids
Sure.
are able to embrace me with incredible, and there's other, but my kids are having a harder time.
Yes.
So that's kind of a lot of what we deal with.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It is that difficult. I spoke at a conference recently on that very issue of what happens when there is difficulty in the relationships that are brought into the new one. That resistance. She's not our mom. Well, we're not expecting you to have her be our mom. We're simply, we're in this place and we'd like you to be happy and grow with us. And
we're all adults. We're all adults.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But the
But I
little
think
kid is in there and the
they are.
teen.
Right. That was one of my lessons.
Oh, wow. Well, as our time together comes to a close, I want to thank you so much for this rich conversation, because these are topics we have not touched on. And I'm simply delighted that I have learned from you. And I love the reminder of beginner's mind. I really, really love that. And to be able to say, how you were saying, how are we doing here?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's wonderful to meet you, Regina. So it's a great conversation, and very happy that you found me and invited me.
Yes, I am too. Thanks to LinkedIn, here we are.
Yeah.
We're linked on.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything else that comes to mind as our time together comes to a close that you'd like to share?
Yeah. Can I share a poem?
Absolutely. I'd love it.
Okay. So this is a poem by a child who was interred in a concentration camp during World War II.
Wow.
And it was called Terezin. It was in outside of it was in Czechoslovakia.
Okay.
Anyway, it was there were a lot of children interred in this camp. Some of them without their parents, many with their parents, and the community of elders was concerned about the children who were isolated from the adults. It was a holding camp, and most of the people were sent to Auschwitz and eventually killed. There were 15,000 children came through the camp, and only 100 survived.
Oh my word!
Yeah, so it was a huge. I mean, anyway, the amazing part of the story is that the adults had programs to educate and support the children, and they had writing workshops and art activities, and they were all underground. And their drawings and their poetry were hidden, and eventually a survivor who knew who they were was able to uncover them, and they were published. And this is a poem by one of the children. The children were all preteens, and this was a translation in English.
Okay.
Okay. He doesn't know the world at all, who stays in his nest and doesn't go out. He doesn't know what birds know best, nor what I want to sing about, that the world is full of loveliness. When dewdrops sparkle in the grass, and earth's aflood with morning light, a blackbird sings upon a bush to greet the dawning after night. Then I know how fine it is to live. Hey, try to open up your heart to beauty. Go to the woods someday and weave a wreath of memory there. Then, if the tears obscure your way, you'll know how wonderful it is to be alive.
Thank you. Because in the midst of grief, sometimes it's hard to want to be alive. Thank you, Robert, so much. This was so rich.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Take deep care.